What do we know about what actually happened here?
Well, essentially, we see from CCTV footage that was on the bridge and from sort of eyewitness phone videos taken soon after, there was a huge explosion in the early hours of this morning, and that appears to have collapsed a section of the road bridge and simultaneously set a train which was on the adjacent railway line on fire, and that burned for many, many hours. It seems that most of the bridge, or a significant part of the bridge, is now impassable. Russian officials have ordered Russian media to refer to the bridge as damaged rather than destroyed, and they've suggested that the explosion was caused by a truck bomb. One of the camera angles that emerged on social media this morning appeared to show two vehicles traveling, two lorries traveling in a westwards direction. One of them appeared to be at the point of the explosion, but I think that's unconfirmed as yet. Certainly, some of the analysis that I've been looking at today suggests that the amount of the amount of explosives, I should say, that would have been required for this kind of attack would have been very difficult for special forces, for frogmen, for divers to have carried with them. That's led to speculation that if it wasn't a truck bomb, it could have been some sort of underwater drone, or indeed the explosives could have been fixed to the bridge in secret. But Russia had gone to great lengths to protect this bridge precisely because it's such an important strategic artery linking the Russian mainland to Crimea.
A really key part of the Russian war effort, as you say. What should we make then of the relative silence from the Ukrainians? The Ukrainian government, as I said, tweeting just simply sick burn in response to this.
Well, that may well be deliberate strategic ambiguity because, of course, an attack on the bridge like this has the risk of eliciting some sort of spectacular Russian escalation. And there is a concern, obviously, from President Putin's rhetoric over the last few weeks, his repeated threats to use nuclear weapons, that an attack like this, an attack on what he will see not only as Russian infrastructure, but on a key symbol of his own power and authority, because you mentioned he ordered the bridge to be built, and indeed he drove the first truck across it when it was opened in 2018. So perhaps that silence from Ukraine, the refusal to explicitly claim responsibility, could be because they don't want to play directly into the hands of the Kremlin. Nonetheless, perhaps we've already seen a sort of predictable calls on Russian social media from the Russian pro-war blogosphere calling for spectacular response. Some people calling for nuclear weapons to be dropped on Kyiv, others calling for a blitz on Ukraine's national infrastructure to try and hit bridges and other civilian structures in Ukraine. So we wait to see how Russia will respond. But I think there's no doubt that President Putin, who's had a difficult few weeks in the war, his forces have lost a lot of territory, suffered a number of defeats. President Putin will be under increasing pressure to be seen to respond.
Jerome, given this bridge is such a significant route into the region for Russian troops, what are the implications for the war effort on the Russian side of this bridge being damaged, of being collapsed?
Well, I think it has two implications for the war effort. The first is the effect it will have on morale. Such a spectacular attack, probably the most significant single attack since the sinking of the Moskva battleship almost 6 months ago, will be a real blow to Russian morale, indeed a real boost to Ukrainian morale. And it's important not to underestimate the effect that will have in the sort of day-to-day interactions on the front lines. I think more widely, of course, this will make it significantly harder for Russia to resupply its forces in Crimea, but crucially beyond Crimea. We're looking into the areas of occupied Ukraine that those troops who pushed out of Crimea are currently holding. Now, it's the troops in Kherson to the northwest of Crimea who are in the fiercest fighting at the moment. They've been rolled back in a series of Ukrainian lightning offensives. Now, those troops, the most forward of those troops, are already looking particularly isolated on the west bank of the Dnieper River. That's a 4-mile wide stretch of water, and Ukraine's forces are threatening to cut them off there. Not only have they got limited bridges across the Dnieper River, they're also now looking at, even were they to fall back, the area they would fall back to is going to find it increasingly difficult to get supplied because of this attack on the Kerch Bridge. The other thing, of course, is this does raise the possibility, it will certainly raise the fear in the minds of Russian commanders that Ukraine could now open a third front. We've seen the first significant counterattack, or really significant counterattack in recent weeks by Ukraine up in northeastern Kharkiv. That's cleared thousands of square miles of territory, pushed the Russians back into Luhansk and Donetsk. We've seen the second offensive down in Kherson. What we may now see is a third attack coming south from Zaporizhia, effectively trying to cut or isolate or harass what is sometimes referred to as the Russian land bridge, the area that they've occupied along the north coast of the Sea of Azov, between Crimea in the west and Mariupol and the Russian mainland in the east. And were that area to be attacked, that would just further stretch Russian forces. And even if it isn't attacked, the very fact that Ukraine knows Russia's going to find it harder to resupply its troops will mean that Russian will be concerned that it's vulnerable to attack, and that vulnerability will force commanders to keep its forces stretched along the line, making it harder for them to reinforce the areas that are facing the most fierce fighting.
And just thinking longer term, Jerome, how significant is this in the wider war effort for Ukraine?
Well, I think exactly how significant it is, we will know in the next few days. But I think, as I said, in terms of the turning points of the war, we've seen a number of chapters. We saw the botched invasion followed by the retreat from Kiev. That was one of the most defining parts of the early conflict. Then we saw a war. It moved into a war of attrition. Russia's sort of artillery slogging match against Ukraine, where they blasted their way through territory, particularly in the east and Donbass. The third phase, perhaps these Ukrainian counterattacks in Kharkiv and Kherson. Now, those three broad chapters, I suppose, have been punctuated by the two spectacular attacks. One, the sinking of the Moskva battleship, the flagship of Russia's Black Sea Fleet. Now, that had significant military implications because that ship had provided the air defense, the missile cover for the rest of the warships on the Black Sea. Without that missile cover, those warships had to retreat, and that effectively left the coast of Ukraine safer. This attack on the bridge, another spectacular, choking off or strangling Russian forces in Crimea, making it much harder for them to resupply. And exactly how much that affects are likely to see it harder for them to continue pushing out of Crimea in the future.